Good morning. Again, it is good to see each of you here as we have this opportunity to come together. Though things may seem strange and things may seem different, it is good that we are able to get together today to worship our great and awesome God and fellowship, loving Him. In the book of Ecclesiastes, of course, that which Solomon wrote, inspired by God, we see that which is an interesting passage found there in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, 1 through 8. And let's go ahead and read that this morning. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to tear and a time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. When we think of what Solomon is proclaiming here, he's saying there is a time for everything. And this passage clearly indicates when it comes to this life, there's going to be highs and there's going to be lows. There's going to be things that at one moment in time we're going to be doing, and then there's going to be moments where we're going to be doing something else. There's going to be situations wherein we see where this is needed, and then other situations where something else is needed. As I said, there's going to be ups and downs. Our small congregation here in our town here in Ramona, it's felt a lot of ups and downs lately. It seems like, in fact, we've seen or felt a lot more downs lately than ups, with things that have happened, with things that have gone on. When we look at everything and we look at things as Solomon is declaring, we see that there's going to be, in time, a roller coaster, so to speak. When I think of what Solomon is saying here, and I think of what the church goes through and has gone through here in Ramona, there are three things in particular that I think we can look at and take from what Solomon said and really, hopefully, build and encourage ourselves knowing what he is saying there. So with this in mind, if you have your handout this morning, let's look at our first point, a time to embrace and a time to refrain. The COVID-19 coronavirus that has taken over the world. It has changed many things. It has changed our worship in the sense of the number of times in which we meet. I can honestly say there's never a moment that I ever considered that a virus would keep us from coming. That would make us, or it would be recommended that, listen, for those times where we don't biblically have to come together, we shouldn't come together for a time. I never thought that would be the case, and yet here we are dealing with this situation. Here we are looking at it. Now, don't get me wrong. Me and John were joking around about this a little bit the other day. I think the media's blown this up a little bit more than than is reality. There are some realities with this that people, and it's good to be cautious, that have gone a little bit overboard in some things. But nevertheless, when we think of the idea of what's being done and the things that have been suggested, for where we're at, this is good. As I said, and will say, as Solomon said, there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain, isn't there? And so I want to, when we look at this particular case, in light of what we're going through, look at this idea of embracing. Over and over in the Scriptures, obviously, the Apostle Paul, inspired by God, talked about the necessity of embracing in holy affection with one another. To the church in Rome, he said, greet one another with a holy kiss. All the churches of Christ greet you. To the church in Corinth, he said, all the brothers send you greetings. Greet one another with a holy kiss. To the church in Thessalonica, again, 1 Thessalonians 5:26, greet all the brothers with a holy kiss. Throughout the scriptures, there is that idea, and we know what it is. We've seen it, we feel it. The necessity to be affectionate with each other. The reality and the need to embrace one another. God created the church where this is a place of like-minded, in-fellowship people who love each other and want that. In fact, need that. God created us that way. To want to be around each other, to want to have that affection, to want to embrace. None of us would argue, I think, that biblically speaking, this is necessary and needed. But when we look at the scriptures, we also see that there are times, as Solomon declared, where we might need to refrain from embracing like we normally do. And I think today is like that. Our situation finds itself in that. We're no longer doing the holy handshake, if you will. Maybe the holy thermometer deal back there, but not the holy handshake per se. What we're doing is practicing what Solomon said. There are going to be situations sometimes where we must refrain from embracing. Now, this isn't necessarily uncommon. When we think back in Scripture, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, all the way back there in the beginning, one of the very first commandments given by God is that a man should cleave to a woman after he leaves his mother and father, should cling to his wife, they shall become one flesh. Therein he gave the command that men and women should marry, get married. That it is a good thing, God created thing that he wants and desires. But there is a circumstance there in 1 Corinthians where they are dealing with a great persecution. They're dealing with a lot of different situations. And Paul says, listen, circumstances, even though God says this is good, this is biblical, this is what he wants, circumstances can change things for a time. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8, he says this, to the unmarried and to the widows I say, that it is good for them to remain single as I am. Now he would go on to say, listen, if you can't, if the lust and the passion is too great, get married. It's better to be married during this time and deal with the difficulties spiritually that come along with marriage during what was going on at that moment than to burn in hell with that lust. But nevertheless, he says, listen, circumstances took what God said is good, and Paul says, if you can, pause for a time. Refrain, if you will, for a moment. Paul, in other words, here is saying, listen, there's a time to marry, and sometimes there might be a time to be single. To those who aren't not married or those who are widowed, look at the circumstances. See what's going on. Obviously, when we look at this, we see this is temporary. Paul wasn't saying for all time. He wasn't saying that everyone else in every other situation had to do this. It was specific to them in their situation. When we think of what we're going through with this coronavirus and the precautions that are being asked, there's nothing biblically wrong. In fact, there's a good thing to say, listen, there's a time to embrace, but right now it's good to refrain from such. To heed the words of Solomon, there is a time where good biblical things can be temporarily suspended and allowed, if temporary, to not violate God's word, to not challenge it. If Paul had said, listen, no one's allowed to marry from this point on, obviously that would violate. But he didn't. He said, with the circumstances and as they are, here's what we see and here's what we know. And so when we think about what Solomon is saying there in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it really does apply, doesn't it, to us today. There's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Right now, we're in a momentary time where we just have to be a bit more cautious how we do things. Solomon also clearly declared there's a time to be born and a time to die. Our small congregation here has seen a lot of death lately. But I want to begin with birth. When you look at that, is there a greater joy, typically speaking, than when a couple finds their child being born? There's no greater amazement or wonder You know, people in the scientific world have always been fascinated and tried to figure out why does a woman who goes through such pain to give birth immediately after that child is born wants that baby. Feels nothing for a moment in time. Everything changes. Why? The joy God has given in such. Birth brings that. There's the fun, the cake, there's the parties, and there's the growing up. Yes, there's challenges with kids, but as God would say, a quiver full is a good thing. They're blessings. As Solomon again aptly said, there's a time to be born. However, as we know, with sin came death. And as people are born and as they grow up, there is that point where death is around the corner. Death is a reality. And unfortunately, as we have seen, as I said, in the last 5 or 6 weeks, here in the church and in our community, we've seen far too much of it. We've dealt with it quite a bit. We see the pain and feel the hurt. When we think of Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, I'm reminded of what the Hebrew writer said there. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes the judgment. Death is a necessity now. It is a reality. There is an appointment for it for everyone. Just like there is a time to be born, as Solomon said, there is a time to die. And that means we have to talk about death and realize what it is and a recognition of it. As I said, we've dealt with a lot of it. There's a sting. There's a power of pain that comes with it. There's a hurt. There's a melting of strength when we deal with a great loss. But thankfully, as Paul would write to the Thessalonians, we're not like those without hope. God doesn't look at death like we do, does he? When God sees death of the righteous and true, he says, precious in his eyes are the death of his saints. That's because he knows, and like he's promised to us, that the righteous and true are with him after this life. We know what happens to our loved ones when they pass from this life to the next. It doesn't make it easier. It doesn't make it just that we can simply move on. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is when we think of death, we want to also remember what God says. And be reminded that what Jesus said there in Matthew 25 and 34, the promise he gave. Then the king will say to those on his right, that being Jesus, come you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. When God created Adam and then Eve from his rib, from the foundation of the world, God established a home for man. For mankind, all those who would follow him, all those who would be faithful to him, he made a promise, didn't he? That not only would we die in the Lord and receive the crown of righteousness, that every single person that does that would get to spend eternity with God, and all those who have also done that. All those who, like us, are striving for that. Thankfully, we can have confidence in our God. Solomon said there's a time to be born and a time to die. And death is painful, it hurts, but there is rejoicing knowing that there is a point in time where we never have to worry about it again. That the pain we all as a congregation are feeling with the loss of those who have been so dear to us, that we can be with them for eternity, never having to feel this again. God has made a promise. There is a time to be born and a time to die. Again, I'm reminded of Hebrews 10, 36 and 39 along this lines of encouragement where it says, for you have need of endurance. The people of the Hebrews were dealing with persecution. Some of them were dying for their faith. And the Hebrew writer says, for you have need of endurance so that when you have done with the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Not suggested, not hoped for, but promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come, and he will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Verse 39. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. The Hebrew writer said to those who are struggling even with losing loved ones. He said, let us not shrink back, but let us preserve our souls to see them again one day. Let us endure to the end. Lastly, I want to talk about and look at what Solomon said. Listen, there's a time to seek and a time to lose. When it comes to finding or seeking, again, the church here in Ramona has been very blessed over the years. From before I was here, and I know since I've been here, we've had many who have stopped by that we've gotten to know, many who have come and even placed their membership for a time that we've enjoyed, grown with, and developed relationships with. There have been those who, through the years, whether it be, as I said, just walking through the doors, or we've gotten to know and encouraged them to come, whatever the case may be, as they were seeking, they found us. They found the church, and as we were seeking for those to love all the more, they found us and we found them, and relationships were built. We have so many stories, so many people that I'm sure we can think of and remember back and reflect on that were here. We also think of what Solomon said in the idea of seeking. I think of the need to not only those who come in, but those we find, as I said, we seek those opportunities. And we look for them who have an open heart and want to hear God's word, want to be obedient. I think we see that relevance in what Solomon is saying as well. As Solomon said, there is a time to seek. But he also said there is a time to lose, right? And when we seek, we have to understand the reality, just like with everything else, there's a possibility of losing that one or those we've come so close with. Jesus made it clear, though, in Matthew 7:7, listen, if we seek, we will find. If we are looking for those who want to obey the gospel, if we're looking for a faithful congregation, we'll find that. And whatever we're looking for, scripturally speaking, God is willing to present that to us. The reality is, though, that as people seek to find us, there's those times where people seek, because of necessity, to find a new congregation. We've dealt with that too. We've been blessed, I said. People have come in. But we've also dealt with loss. There's a time to seek and a time to lose. When I think of that, I think of no greater example of that since I've been here than the Gleasons and now Betty. Betty wanted to be here so dearly, knowing this is probably the last Sunday, that she would get to be here. I think of that specifically with her. But as I thought about that and I was reflecting upon that, we are getting a great loss, there's no doubt. A great faithful Christian woman who is a pillar everywhere she goes in righteousness and truth. If I could ever forget or know what she's forgotten, I'll be pretty excited. However, when I think about the reality, and especially what Solomon says here, as we lose, someone else is gaining. The church where she's going to go is going to be bountifully blessed by her. We are losing a Christian lady here in the church, but they are gaining a great Christian lady. In this case, again, what Solomon said is true for us. A time to weep, but there is a time to laugh. A time to mourn, but a time to dance. As we weep, they rejoice. As we mourn, they dance, because they are getting that one. What Paul would say also, I think, is aptly true in this situation. Even though we're sad to see her go, I'm reminded what Paul would say of Phoebe there in Romans 16:1 and 2. I commend you to our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints and help her in whatever she may need for you, for she has been a patron of many and of myself as well. We could replace the word Phoebe, obviously, with Betty and others like Joe. That though we don't want to see them go, we know that as we have lost, they have sought and found. There is a time for everything. I know it seems like we're getting the negative end of a lot of that. We've had a lot of death. We're not able to embrace right now like we would want to in these situations. We're losing a dear member, and we've lost in the past. Things can be powerful and tough all at the same time. It can be hard, but I want to remind you of what God says throughout Scriptures, that even though this world and the things of it can bring difficulties, even though there is negative time and there is positive time, and even though we're in that negative time, I want to remind you what God said throughout eternity to those who would be struggling. To Abraham, the father of the many faithful, he would say this in Genesis 15:1, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." To his son Isaac, he would later say in 26 and 24, "And the Lord appeared to him in the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you, and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake." Moses, as the people were getting ready to go in and take the promised land, having failed before, to a people who were no doubt nervous, God said this to Moses to the people in Deuteronomy 31:6-8, "Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you." Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall put them in possession of it. It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed." David, in Psalm 56, we get a glimpse of what he was thinking while he was in captivity to his enemy, the Philistines. And in Psalm 56:3-4 it says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" The same God who was there for Abraham, the same God who was there for Isaac and David, who was there for the Israelites and every other faithful Christian from the beginning of time. The same God says to us there in Hebrews 13:8, He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God whom we are here to serve today, even in these uncertainties, even in the challenges that we might be facing at this moment. The same God that was the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is our God whom we worship today. The same God who says, "Lean on me. Trust in me. Let me lead you through these trying times," is the God whom we are serving this morning. I know things are hard. I know things are challenging. I know things are scary. But God has said, rest assured in Him. Believe in Him. Trust in Him. He will not leave us nor forsake us. These are uncertain times. But as Solomon said, there is a time for everything. And this time will pass. There will be an uptick. There will be a point again where we can see the glorious realities of what this earth delivers and the opportunities it affords. Let us, when difficulty arises, let us understand there is a time for everything. And we might need to grieve, we might need to mourn, we might need to go through whatever it is the case, but remember, God is there. He loves us. He will never leave us nor forsake us. He wants us with Him for eternity, and if we want to be with Him for eternity, let us strive for the same, for that crown of righteousness. So this morning, as you reflect upon this and think about it, if you need the prayers of this church, let us know. If you need us to help you and strengthen you, that's what we're here for. God said, come together that we may encourage one another, 1 Thessalonians 4:5. If you need that encouragement this morning in particular, let us be that for you by letting us know as we stand and as we sing.